Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here. My topic is associated with air power and warfare, lessons from economic and military history. I hope my tone is okay for our interpreters. Now, let's start with some basic theoretical concepts. Now, Clausewitz points out the military aspect of warfare. You are all aware of this. But the interesting point is that he also speaks about economics. He practically says that even if the air, land or sea forces, I'm using a modern term, okay, are victorious in the tactical theater of war, if the home front collapses, if the general population doesn't support the war effort, then sooner or later any government will have to seek a diplomatic solution, no matter what is happening on the tactical theater of operations. Now, this is crucial. And this is what generated the concept of total war. Because in the concept of total war, what we have is, from the one side, we have, here we are. We have the military objectives: destroy the enemy land, naval and air forces, fortifications, installations, and its ability to wage war. And on the other hand, what we also have is the economic objectives of warfare, in other words, target the enemy's home front. And with the term target the enemy's home front, I mean you destroy the economic infrastructure of the enemy, its terrestrial network, roads, telecommunications, industrial capacity, energy facilities, civilian targets. However, when you make, and this is essential, when you make the home front of the enemy a legitimate target, you have to respect the Geneva Convention. That means you have to respect the general rules of law, which means that, okay, destroy the infrastructure, but don't kill the civilians. And we have always to bear in mind that in the case of Greece, the Greek armed forces historically have respected the spirit of the Geneva Convention and the rules of law. The Greek forces have never committed atrocities of mass scale or, genocides. It is others who have done that. And we must always remember that according to international law, hostilities start after the formal declaration of war. The formal declaration of war, excuse me. So these are essential things and we have to take them into consideration. Now, having said that, another essential issue that I have to point out is the fact that in war, the duration of the war is not certain. We may plan for short-term wars, but eventually we may end up with long-term wars. I'll give you just one example. When the First World War erupted in August 1914, everyone was expecting that by December 1914, the boys will be back home for Christmas. It turned out that it wasn't December 1914, but it was December 1918. So this is another aspect that we have to take into consideration. And that's the general theory. These are the theoretical points that I want to emphasize in this brief presentation. Now, I have here, how do you combine these elements? You have either the option to target military targets, you have either the option to attack and destroy economic targets. Obviously, if you can do at the same time both, that's the best optimum solution in warfare. But, this is not always possible, so we have to make choices. And One essential thing is that, remember that I have put this down here, the Occam razor principle of simplicity. Occam was a monk, a British monk of the 14th century, and he made the essential, introduced this essential principle which says that, look, keep things simple. Operations have to be simple, not complex. The more complex operations are, the less the probability of success. We need simplicity. Now, and the other important theoretical point here is time. Okay, you have your own plans. Do you have the time to implement your plans? Will the enemy allow you to implement your plans? So this is something that you have to take into consideration. And obviously you make tactical priorities according to geography, climate, political and economic considerations. It's a different story if you fight a war in the Atlantic. It's a different story if you fight a war in the desert. It's a different story if you fight a war in the jungle, where there is dense forestry, like Vietnam. So, you know, there are a lot of things that you have to take into consideration. Now, coming back to the case of economic warfare, okay, obviously economic targets, business targets destroy or interrupt enemy's trade. We have seen this in the First World War when the British Navy practically sealed the North Sea and there was no way that the Germans could import or export any goods. Obviously you have financial warfare, banking and finance. You can do this either before the war or during the operations of war. That is, you trigger inflation to the enemy country, you destabilize enemy currency, you destroy enemy's reserves of foreign currency, gold and so on. So obviously you destroy its ability to finance the war effort. But obviously these are general frameworks. I have to come back. This is essential. Yesterday our American general pointed out about Air Force policing. I was thinking that this is essential in the case of energy security. If you have a pipeline which you have to safeguard, then obviously this is another task for the Air Force during the crisis. You may have to do this because you have to make certain that the flow of oil or natural gas is not interrupted during the war operations. But let's come to our case studies. I have 5 case studies in this paper. Obviously I don't have a lot of time to elaborate. However, I'll try to do my best here. Now I'll start with a simple one, the one which is not on the slides. I have 4 on the slides, 1 is not on the slides, because it's very simple. It's the second air war of Iraq from March 19 to April 21st, 2003. So practically we're talking about 1 month operations. During that period we have a total allied force of roughly 1,800 aircraft, 783 to be precise, and against them there is an Iraqi air force of 255 fighters and bombers. So you understand that the ratio is overwhelmingly in favor of the coalition forces. Now, the main priority are not the economic targets, but obviously military targets. And what we have is more than 47,600 sorties of all types. From those, 17,200 are strike sorties, 5,550 are air supremacy sorties, 3,400 C2I sorties, and so on. The statistics are all in the paper. You can go there and find them. There's no point to say all these statistics right now. And obviously, with this immense superiority, the outcome of this one-month operation was obvious. The coalition forces succeeded in both air and ground over the Iraqi Air Force. Now, this is the simple one. Now let's go to the more complex cases, which are here. Now the first case is the Battle of Britain. And I don't know if we have the map here. Oh, here we are. Okay, now, when the Battle of Britain starts, the initial strategic objective of the Luftwaffe is to destroy the RAF either on the ground or on the air. And the initial objective of the Luftwaffe is the airfields of number 11 group under Commander Park. This is the main objective. And the main objective is... Oh, I'm not, eh? Okay, then I'll sit down. The main objective is to destroy the airfields of the 11 group and force the British to retreat to the airfields of number 13 group. So this is a purely military objective, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the campaign starts practically in the beginning of August, and by mid-September, the shift changes. Due to accidents, German bombers bomb London, the British retaliate on Berlin, and the shift goes from purely military targets to economic targets, bomb the British cities in order to destroy the morale of the civil population and so force the enemy, okay, to sue for peace. But when the Germans do this, this is a very big tactical error. And why this is a very big tactical error? It's a very big tactical error because when they turn their attention to London and to other British cities, what's happening is that the airfields, which have been heavily damaged by the former Luftwaffe sorties, have time to repair. And also the other essential problem is that for the first time the German aeroplanes come close to the range of the RAF planes of the 12th group of Lee Mallory. So practically the RAF can add the reserves into the battle. So practically this shift from strategic military objectives to strategic economic objectives was a failure. It cost the Germans the campaign. So this is, the point for the first case study. Now the second case study is, I'll have to go here, to the Vietnam War. Now in the Vietnam War, you can see that between 1964 to 1973, the US Air Force is using 7,188,032 tons of bombs against targets in North Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. But eventually the US loses the war. Why this is happening? The first problem is that although they have all this massive accumulation of air power, they do not disrupt enemy communications. Only the Chinese, and the Chinese have already opened up their archives, the Chinese supply to North Vietnam between 64 to 75, 1 million, almost 2 million rifles, 65,000 roughly artillery pieces, 1 billion bullets, 17 million artillery shells, and you can see the rest. We don't have yet the data from the Soviet aid, but you can see some estimates which come from declassified CIA documents there. Now, what was happening in Vietnam? Here we are, here's the map. Now this is essential. I don't know, what's happening is that this is the Ho Chi Minh area. Now, the Ho Chi Minh Passage is dense forest, complete cover from airstrikes. And this is the supply route of the Viet Congs. this extends to Cambodia, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and Laos. Now, the US Air Force concentrates its effort to bomb this Ho Chi Minh Passage. 5 minutes? Give me 7. And what is happening is that although the effort goes there, the real effort of the North Vietnamese is up in the north. The Soviets every day sent one supply ship to the port of Hai Phong. And on the borders between China and North Vietnam, the Chinese sent their aid to North Vietnam and their military advisors. Now, what was happening was that the US administration at the time, President Johnson and his Defense Minister McNamara, were very careful not to escalate the conflict of Vietnam to a confrontation with China and the USSR. So all airstrikes had to be approved by the White House. The White House had to approve the target, the White House had to approve the time, the White House had to approve everything. This is not what the US military wanted, but they couldn't do anything. So practically, when the US effort is on the Ho Chi Minh area, the supply of North Vietnam from both China and the Soviet Union is uninterrupted in the north. And it's only in December 1973 that the US decide to do what? To bomb Hanoi and Hai Phong and the main supply routes of North Vietnam, and then the war takes a diplomatic turn. Now, so this is another case study here. The third case study, because I don't have time and apologies for this, is the Israeli campaign in Lebanon in 2006. Now, the Israeli campaign starts with a purely military objective. What is the military objective? Destroy Hamas and Hezbollah and its ability to wage war on North Israel and Central Israel. Now, as the campaign progresses, it's obvious that Hamas and Hezbollah's military targets cannot be destroyed. The Israeli government wants a quick resolution to the war, a quick end to the war, so they shift the emphasis from military targets to economic targets. And what is happening is that the Israeli Air Force destroys the economic infrastructure of Lebanon. And, you know, this is a partial defeat, partial victory for Israel. Hamas and Hezbollah arsenal was not destroyed. There was a second attempt in 2009, but the economic infrastructure which supported it was completely destroyed. So, you know. And my final case, sorry for taking some of the extra time, apologies for this, is the Second World War, the point-blank offensive of the Allies on the German industry. Now, you can see that in 1942, the RAF and the USA Air Force dropped 46,000 tons of bombs against Germany and occupied Europe. In 1943, they dropped 214,000. In 1944, 1,157,000. And even in the last months of 1945, an additional 1.1 million tons of bombs. So in total, during 42 to 45, the Allies dropped 2.5 million bombs in German cities and German infrastructure and occupied Europe in general. And obviously, the aim is to disrupt the ability of the Reich to wage war. How these were delivered, you can see that in total we have 6.6% on airfields, 4.3% on shipyards, 2.6% on ball bearing facilities, 29% on the oil industry, 4% on chemical industry, 0.2% of bombs on rubber industry, 2.20% on tank industry, 1% on car industry, transportation network, 41% of bombs. The rest goes on German towns, and in general, approximately 63% of all inhabited towns is destroyed. But what is happening with the German war production? What is the response of Germany to the air war? Obviously, at the tactical level is to increase. The Germans built the so-called Kammhuber line. And you can see initially from 1,845 anti-aircraft batteries in 1942, excuse me. By 1944, there are 4,237 anti-aircraft batteries with more than 70,000 guns. And you can see that the average consumption of cells per month increases from 800,000 cells in 1942 to 16 million cells for the anti-aircraft artillery in 1944. And the question is, did the Allied bombing interrupt the German war production? Well, a lot of ink has been written about this. The actual numbers say that the Allied bombing was not ineffective, because you can see that the aircraft production, for example, increased from 10,000 aircrafts in 1940 to 40,000 aircrafts in 1944. The production of submarines increased from 48 submarines in 1940 to 264 submarines in 1943, roughly the same amount in 1944. Ammunition production increases from 865,000 tons in 1940 to the astonishing level of 3,350,000 tons in 1944. Tank production increases from 5,000 pieces in 1941 to 27,000 in 1944, and artillery, all types of guns, field guns, anti-aircraft guns, mountain guns, light guns, naval guns, railway guns, all of them increases from 30,000 in 1941 to the astonishing level of 361,000 by 1944. So just looking at these statistics, someone may say, look, the bombing was ineffective. More than 10,000 Allied aircraft were lost, and what was the result? Well, actually, it's not this story. The result is that if the bombing hadn't occurred, the German war production would have been much, much more higher. And the armaments minister of Hitler, Albert Speer, in his memoir, Speer says that if the bombing was not there, we would have saved more than 1 million men and thousands of guns, and all these would have been transported to the Russian front. So, you know, I don't have time here, but I presume I gave you an overall idea how, you know, economic versus military objectives and how this can be applied in case of war by the Air Force can be met. Thank you for your presence here, and if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer them.